Welcome to this afternoon's event. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'm delighted this afternoon to be presenting the Main Line series hosted by the Haverford School and its headmaster, John Nagl. We have, this afternoon, we have again, two folks who are familiar to most of you. We have John, of course, and Jacques deLisle, who is the director of FPRI's Asia program. I'd also like to give a special shout out to our co-chairs of this program, James Gately, John Piasecki, and Eileen Rosenau, as well as the members and supporters and partners and our board, without whom we could not continue bringing you these events. This afternoon's topic is going to be especially interesting and topical. It's about the aggressive behavior of China, increasingly aggressive behavior of China, both in the military and the economic spheres. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screen is a Q&A button, and you can go ahead and start putting your questions in there right from the outset. I'd like to first introduce John Nagl, who, as I just said, most of you already know, so I don't have to say a lot, but John is the 9th headmaster of the Haverford School, and he's also, almost more importantly to us, a senior fellow at FPRI. He's been at the Haverford School since 2013, but he was also the president of the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C., which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. He served on the Defense Policy Board and on the Reserve Forces Policy Board, and has testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He served in the Army for 20 years. He led a tank platoon in Operation Desert Storm and served as an operations officer of a tank battalion task force in Operation Iraqi Freedom. He's also one of the principal authors of the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, which is the principal doctrine used in counterinsurgency containment by the U.S. Department of Defense. He's a distinguished graduate of the United States Military Academy and a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, where he earned master's and doctoral degrees. He's also a frequent commentator and author in prominent publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. So without further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to John. Thank you again for hosting.
Thank you, Raleigh, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Main Line Briefings on Global Affairs. While I wish I was welcoming you to our wonderful auditorium downstairs here at the Haverford School, and perhaps to a bit of wine and cheese beforehand, I'm afraid this virtual view of my office is the best we can do under these circumstances. I do hope all of you are well. I'm absolutely delighted to start the year by welcoming Jacques deLisle back to this series. Jacques is the director of FPRI's Asia program. He's the Stephen A. Kozin Professor of Law, as well as a professor of political science, and the director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Jacques specializes in Chinese politics and legal reform, U.S.-China relations, cross-strait relations, and China's engagement with the international legal order, such as it is. Jacques' most recent books include To Get Rich is Glorious, which I think all of us can agree with, Challenges Facing China's Economic Reform and Opening at 40, published by Brookings in 2019, China's Global Engagement, published by Brookings in 2017, The Internet, Social Media, and a Changing China, published by the University of Pennsylvania in 2016, China's Challenges, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2015, and Political Changes in Taiwan under Ma Yinao, published by Routledge in 2014. And yes, the string continues. He does have a book in pre-publication right now. Really an extraordinary record of scholarship. Jacques publishes in journals as well as books. He serves regularly as an expert witness on issues involving the People's Republic of China, Hong Kong, and Taiwanese law and government policies. He received his JD and graduate education in political science at Harvard University. Jacques' talk today is titled A Fight to the Top, Rising Tensions with China. He'll talk for about 30 minutes and then we'll engage in dialogue for another half hour. Feel free to put questions in the chat room at the bottom of the page beginning now. And I can absolutely guarantee you, because of the technology we're using today, only one person is going to talk at a time tonight. And right now, that person is going to be Jacques deLisle. Jacques, welcome back.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be back, and thank all of you for joining us. And yes, John and I will manage not to talk over one another or to get into a debate, I'm sure. That long string of books, by the way, I'm only one of the contributors to each of them. They're definitely collaborative efforts. And as to today's talk, we've called it Fight to the Top, but I think you could almost equally call it Race to the Bottom. So I'm going to go through a few areas of friction in what is the world's most important bilateral relationship and an increasingly fraught one. So I'm going to focus in parts of each of what I think are the three major areas: economics, security, and politics, or sort of ideational conflict. So if we look at the economic side of things, we've all been talking for some time now about the trade wars of the Trump era. And that's certainly been the flashpoint in a longer running and growing set of economic frictions. It started out as a pretty happy story. If we dial the clock back, you can go back to the late 1970s when China began its era of reform and opening to the outside world. And China basically joined the international economic system on terms that were status quo terms. China was accepting the world more or less as it was and was moving from a planned economy, an autarkic economy close to the outside world, toward, not to, but toward the then already dominant market norms and what was a fairly liberal order for trade and investment. The idea was markets mattered more, barters mattered less, and so on. That was good for China, and it was generally good for the world economy as China became a source of pretty high quality and pretty inexpensive goods, and followed essentially the comparative advantage game that East Asian states prior to China had played in the post-war period, starting out in lower-end manufacturing and working one's way up the value chain. By 2000, China entered the World Trade Organization, and it did so without a sweet deal. It didn't get some of the breaks that developing countries got under the WTO system, and it did not get some of the breaks that countries transitioning from socialist planned economies did. That's partly because China was already too big to be allowed in under rules that were more generous than the usual WTO norms, although there were some phase-in periods that gave China some breathing room. Well, in the years since, starting not really too long after 2000, but especially in more recent years, the troubles have been growing. The issues, the focus of US concerns about China's unfair behavior are familiar and have mounted over time. One of the issues was currency manipulation, keeping the renminbi, the Chinese currency, artificially low to boost exports. That's really an issue that is now a bygone one, not really a phenomenon now, although you sometimes heard it from the early days of the Trump administration. Secondly, Chinese state subsidies to industry, cheap capital, protection against competition in various forms that basically made these companies competitive in the Chinese markets and increasingly abroad. And that meant both declining sort of Chinese Rust Belt industries, but it also meant emerging higher tech industries over time. Thirdly, protectionism, limits to market access for US companies, especially in lucrative service sectors and increasingly over time in social media sectors where US firms had a competitive advantage, but were not allowed free access. Limits on inbound, limits on inbound foreign investment and mergers and acquisitions of Chinese companies by US would-be acquirers. That package of, again, protecting Chinese firms from outside competition and American acquisition, as well as a more general phenomenon of favoritism for Chinese firms, tilted playing fields, things which are often done very subtly and not through open policy or flat out cash transfer. And of course, rising over time, the concern finally about intellectual property loss, whether it be theft or coerced transfer or just general diffusion as employees would hop from one company to another. So that's the list of complaints. And this led to a phenomenon in US-China relations that is part of the negative turn. In effect, as those complaints mounted, US firms and the US government that listens to them lost patience with China coming fully into line with the many commitments for openness and liberalism that it had made in the WTO context and more generally. There was growing frustration with Chinese economic statism, increasingly called state capitalism, and economic nationalism, which actually increased. So instead of progress toward openness and liberalism, we saw some reversals, beginning in the Hu Jintao years in the later half of the first decade of the century and beyond, but accelerating sharply under Xi Jinping. Most famously in things like the Made in China 2025 policy, the aggressive industrial policy to promote Chinese national champions in a variety of sectors, primarily technology. And over time, China has moved in increasingly to those high-end sectors, partly through legitimate progress of economic growth and building up its human and technological base, and partly through more questionable methods of protectionism and IP theft and so on. But as China moves into these sectors, it starts to hit the US where it hurts. Not the loss of industries that were going anyway, but the loss of high value added, still vibrant ones. And the political consequences of this kind of economic openness, the consequences in the US also did mean losing some of these manufacturing jobs and so on, not to China specifically, but because of China's scale in the global economy, it looked as if things were going to China. It became a political issue in the United States and became a source of friction in the relationship as the stereotypical Trump voter, for instance, voted for getting tough on China to supposedly get those jobs back. We also have seen in the last few years the increasing securitization, making a national security issue out of economic concerns. So the concerns about Huawei, TikTok, WeChat, ZTE, the Chinese tech companies and China's social media companies are not just about economic competition in valuable sectors, how much the US will be open for Chinese companies and how much China will open its markets to the US, but it became a source of security concerns. Are there trapdoors in Huawei 5G systems? What kind of information is being gathered from American-based users of WeChat, TikTok, and so on? At the same time, over this period, the US begins to back away from its traditional post-war support of an open international economic order, whether it be the Trump tariffs, the hamstringing of the WTO by preventing the appointment of enough judges to hear the cases in the appellate body, the opting out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, all of these things that look like American economic nationalism and turning away from its support for a liberal, rules-based international economic order. And we've also seen a loss in the political side of the US support for engaging China. That is the belief in constructive engagement, the belief that bringing China into the global economy, linking it to the US, would lead to better Chinese international behavior and perhaps even political change in China. The confidence in that is gone. And that's why constructive engagement is essentially a dead policy. All that's led to more or less where we are now in terms of the economic relationship, and it's not good. The tit-for-tat tariff war, in which the US has lacked a clear priority. Trump has tended to emphasize the balance of payments bilaterally, which is about the least important and least relevant of the issues. The battle has extended increasingly into the tech sector and into foreign investment. And there's been increasingly a policy drive on the US side, mirrored on the Chinese side, partly defensively, that has been accelerating an already existing trend of decoupling, of essentially delinking the US and Chinese relationship economically to some degree and raising the prospect of two economic camps and maybe two different technology-centered structures for everything from the internet to 5G and so on. Regional states in East Asia and Asia more generally are caught in the middle. But the problem of this feud is that it is hurting the US's friends in the region. See what's happening with, say, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which is getting pulled between its biggest customer, Huawei, and its source of lucrative contracts and technology, the US. You see Korea caught in the middle and so on. And the view from the region is that the US and China are both at fault for this mess and the tensions and the pull that's being exerted on local states in East Asia and South Asia. And China essentially sees itself as being in a pretty good position here because for all its problems, it's seen as providing economic opportunities in the region through the Belt and Road Initiative and other things that are troubled, certainly, but are grander, larger scale than the US response through the rather small economic component of the Trump era free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And the US is no longer seen as defending these public goods, this open and deeply integrated, open economy and deeply integrated global value chain that everybody benefited from in the region. And so the US is not providing these kinds of public goods. And we've seen China step into the void and advance its own interests by portraying itself as the defender of economic globalization and openness. You see Xi Jinping at Davos, the sort of uber globalization meeting, talking about how China is supporting economic integration and the US is casting doubt on it. And so what you see going on here is essentially this decoupling, this backing away from integration, and indeed putting at risk one of the things that has been the ballast in US-China relations. That is what made a US-China Cold War unthinkable and made it unlike the US-Soviet relationship was in part that there was this economic integration that gave both sides a material stake in not blowing things up literally or metaphorically. Let me turn more briefly to a couple of other issues. First, the security side. This is getting ugly too. There is a security rivalry of a sort we have not seen before between the US and China. You see it in things like the Trump administration's national security strategy from late 2017 and other policy documents that have followed upon that characterize China as a revisionist power and a rival, right up there with Russia as being adverse to US interests and a threat. Here too, it's not out of nowhere. It's been a long growing concern. Territorial disputes are probably the most visible focus of this, and China has been increasingly assertive over the last decade on several of these issues. So if you look to the South China Sea, China's been pushing other states farther back. It built up those island forms in the South China Sea that it controls and has turned them into military use areas. They have bases on them that can be used for stationing forces. You look to the East China Sea, where there's a long-running dispute with Japan over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. And there in recent years, China has destabilized what had been de facto Japanese control over the region. Taiwan, which China views as unrecovered territory, we're now back into a phase of high tensions there since Tsai Ing-wen, from what China regards as a pro-independence party, became president a little over 4 years ago. And in its own way, I think it can characterize the troubles in Hong Kong, the assertion of Beijing's control over Hong Kong, the suppression of civil liberties there, the adoption of this harsh national security law. That is essentially a stronger Chinese assertion of control over territory that had something of an international aspect to it. You look at what's going on in Xinjiang and Tibet, the same kind of thing, essentially saying this is China's territory, everybody else butt out. And you're starting to see old things come back even farther away from East Asia, and that is the China-India border clash. Never resolved, it's gone kinetic, it's got into an actual set of skirmishes in recent months. So what you see is again, a much more assertive posture, sometimes coming to violence, and certainly threats of force on territorial issues, and those are a proxy for a more general security posture. And you have seen throughout the Xi Jinping era an increasingly assertive Chinese foreign policy. The old Deng Xiaoping dictum of hide your brightness, nourish obscurity has given way to the other half of the couplet, which is actively accomplish something. China's definition of its core interests, which are essentially China's casus bellum list, has extended to some sort of gray zone things, like perhaps the South China Sea, and an economic development, which of course can take in a great number of security issues, given China's now far-flung economic interests. And China has increased its military capacity. It was a real wake-up call when China saw what US forces were able to do in the Gulf War, and when it saw what happened in the Taiwan Straits crisis of '96, when the US sent ships through the region. And now that China has more far-flung interests with the Belt and Road Initiative, its investments abroad and so on, it has a sense that it needs to protect those interests. So we've seen the buildup of a blue water navy, of force projection capabilities, the acquisition of aircraft carriers, upgrading nuclear submarines and so on, and the attempt to have the capacity to make it expensive and perhaps impossible for the US to intervene in actual conflict scenarios in China's near abroad. So China's been building up, it's been building up the means and the will to be more assertive on these security issues at the same time that the US has lost some credibility and clout. The Obama era pivot or rebalance is viewed with a fair amount of contempt in China and a fair amount of skepticism around the world as having been quite hollow. The Trump era's unholy mix of America first, transactionalist, and ally bullying foreign policy has been balanced a bit by the FOIP, but the FOIP is full of foibles. It is actually fairly hollow itself. And it really is not much of an answer for those who are worried about Chinese expansionism, or at least Chinese assertiveness in the region. And particularly with the free and open Indo-Pacific, one of the things you hear in the region and from Chinese critics as well, is that it doesn't have an economic leg. And in Asia, the economic leg still matters. So the TPP and the pivot were a pair. The FOIP doesn't have that kind of economic component at the very moment when China is building up the Belt and Road Initiative to increase its own economic inducements. There is a bright spot here for the United States in this regional race for influence, and that is everybody in the region has had the bejesus scared out of them by what China is up to. So although China-Japan relations have recovered in the late years of Abe's term, they were really bad, and Abe is proof of concept that Japan can be a more normal power, a more muscular power in its dealings with China. Australia has gotten deeply alienated from China and has climbed sort of into the US lap. US-India relations are never going to be great, but India's relations with China are now sufficiently bad that those four countries, the Quad as they're called, are not on the same page, but are all a good deal more skeptical of China than they used to be. And the smaller powers in the region have taken to reciting when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, and they're hedging. And they have great incentives to hedge against Chinese coercion, and China has played its hand rather ham-fistedly. They've tried to rebrand the Belt and Road Initiative, they've tried to play win-win scenarios, but there's a great deal of worry because China has been flexing its muscles in the region. And so what you have here is an increasingly adversarial relationship, genuine conflicts of interest, plus this fraught adversarial language. And I think there's a real misperception, or at least difference of perception issue, that increases the risks. I sometimes call it security dilemmas with Chinese-US characteristics. That is, each side sees itself as doing something perfectly legitimate in its security interests. The US is the long-term provider of the international public goods of a stable and peaceful order in the Western Pacific from which everybody benefits. In our view, that's all we're doing. China instead says, what are you doing parking your Navy on our doorstep? This is an inappropriate way to treat a regional great power and ultimately the dominant power in the region. The US view is, China, what are you up to? You've been doing well with this system, and now suddenly you want to be able to have the capacity to close off sea lanes, and you only sort of say that you would never think about doing that, so you're actually trying to change the status quo. So each side can see its own views, its own actions as legitimate, and the other side's as assertive and destabilizing. And you do see, the concern here, I think, that China's capacity to catch up, which has grown considerably, is being projected out a little bit aggressively by some in China. So there are a lot of people who buy this power transition theory, the US is in decline, China's on the rise, and there's a risk of getting out over their skis, of overestimating the rapidity with which China can take on the US in various scenarios. And I gotta say, the early returns on last night's debate from China are, yeah, boy, that place is in trouble. That is, the US is in trouble. And one worries about again, going to the heads of some of the hawks in China, and the more moderates in China are worried about that. And there is, I think, in addition to this increasing risk of miscalculation at almost a strategic level, there's the ever-present risk of inadvertent conflict, the small incident that scales up, right? So we had the EP3 incident way back in 2001, when there was a collision with a Chinese plane following a Chinese warplane following a US reconnaissance plane too closely, colliding and so on. We've seen lots of incidents at sea. We've seen cutting the lines for drones being dragged by US naval ships. There are a lot of these incidents that get really close, and we do not have a good framework in place for that. The US-China incident management, crisis management framework is not what it was with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And we've seen a decline in military contacts in the last few years that creates greater risk of each side not knowing quite what the other side is doing and what its doctrine is at the micro level. Finally, since I'm running out of time here, I want to turn to the fancy word ideational, which really means political, ideological, if you will. And this is where the new Cold War theory really has the final piece come into place. So if the economic linkages start fraying, that clears away one of the impediments to a Cold War. If security relations turn sour in the way that I've described, that creates the sort of next step forward. But to get a full-blown Cold War, you need ideological conflict too. That is, this is about whose system is better and should be the guide for parts of the rest of the world. I'm not saying we're getting there, but it's more plausible than it used to be. And this was a long time coming as well. The US constructive engagement belief that in its more robust or excessive forms believed that we would change China by engaging China in a way that would make it more like us and more acceptable to us. That theory is gone. Nobody really buys it anymore. But short of that, there was a sense that engaging China would at least lead to more status quo supporting international behavior. That too is now fraying, and the language is much more about rivalry, about who's going to shape the international system regionally in the Western Pacific and also ultimately globally. So China used to chafe at this notion of peaceful evolution, that the US would try to change China in some way. We started to see a pushback during the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao years. But since Xi Jinping has come to power, we've seen it take a big leap, great leap even forward. That is, Xi Jinping now has dropped the shyness that we used to see about promoting a Chinese model. People started talking about the Chinese model, you know, the Beijing consensus, things like that. But many Chinese sources were reluctant to push it very hard because Chinese exceptionalism, unlike American exceptionalism, is not evangelical. It says we're just different. But now we're starting to see this, you should learn from us. The world should learn from us. And Xi Jinping has started pushing that line at the 19th Party Congress. And we're seeing it show up in ways that matter tangibly for the ideas side of international relations. So we're seeing China turning away from its acceptance of human rights universalism to say, basically, don't lecture us about what we do at home and don't push your Western liberal views of human rights. China is much more influential at the Human Rights Council of the UN, which the US has also opted out of. And you see China essentially saying this model of state capitalism with fairly authoritarian politics works pretty darn well. And we're at least going to make the world safe for autocracy. At the same time, you see the US starting to talk regime change in a way we haven't seen before. You've seen from the Trump administration, and particularly Pompeo, talking about the idea that the Chinese Communist Party is one thing, but China and the Chinese people are another thing. And really portraying this essentially as a whole of society, whole of government struggle. That's a much more ideologically laden notion of US-China relations and a conflictual one. COVID has, as with everything else, compounded this, with each side blaming the other and blaming the other's failed responses on flaws in its basic domestic political system. So the US, particularly the Trump administration and many in Congress, have criticized China's authoritarianism as the reason that things were opaque and the reason the virus got out. And China has looked at the US and said, the dysfunction of your system, the failures of your political system are responsible for your own COVID mess. Last night's debate here again did not help. And once again, the US is largely AWOL on a lot of the values issues in foreign policy that the US never pushed that robustly, but that at least have been part of the mix. So if you add the current relatively soft stance on dictators, the opting out of the UN Human Rights Council, the very selective focus on religious rights, and the US's democratic poor performance, which is getting some pretty negative reviews these days, the US has lost some of the ideological, some of the soft power high ground, particularly with states caught in the middle of a growing US-China conflict. So finally, has China gone all Russia? That is it to the point of trying to destabilize US politics rather than point out the all too evident flaws? Not yet. We don't yet have anything like election interference. Chinese hacking around is mostly information gathering, mostly trying to figure out what US policies would be under a Biden versus a continued Trump administration. But we do have proof of concept. China did behave toward the last Taiwanese elections very much the way Russia behaved toward the US elections. Disinformation, amplification of divisions, things like that. So they're developing the toolkit. But in the short run, I don't think that's really China's agenda, because I think it's unclear how China does under two different scenarios, more of Trump or Biden. I think there's one view of things in China that says this is all structural, it's all long-term, it doesn't much matter who the American president is. For a view that's a little more contingent, there's some division of opinion. The hawks in China who want to see the US decline tend to favor Trump. They think he'll continue that trajectory. But the more moderate types tend to think China does better in a system that is not completely unraveling. And in between or across both of those, there is a sense that China has benefited to a significant degree from the status quo. It's not a thoroughly anti-status quo power the way Russia is, and that China is not yet ready or willing to step up and replace the US as a shaper of rules and institutions. So at the very least, even if China is no longer hiding its brightness, it still is to some degree biding its time. And with that, I'll stop and take questions and comments.
That was enormously cheery, Jacques. Thanks for thanks for all that. Well, you talked around, I think, but did not directly address China's treatment of the Uyghurs. Can I get you to make this even cheerier? Can I get you to delve into that a little bit, please, and then we'll go to the questions that are stacking up in the Q&A box.
It's exceedingly bleak. I mean, I don't think there's really anything particularly hopeful to be said there. It is probably the most underattended human rights abuse on a large scale we've got going right now. It is at least cultural genocide, and it's pretty unapologetic. What's going on there? Well, part of it is, it's far away in the country you don't really get to. Partly China has benefited from the lingering anti-terrorism views in the West and in the US by portraying, not terribly plausibly, that the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and the other Turkic Muslims, not limited to the Uyghur ethnic group in Xinjiang, are the kinds of things you need to stamp out because of the risk of extremism. And I think China is less amenable to outside pressure than it used to be. That's part of the story that I was telling earlier. And I think it's partly one of the, there are many opinions on many issues in China. Those who are even fairly liberal on most issues tend to have something of a blind spot for ethnic minorities in China, whether it be Tibet or Xinjiang. So there's not even the usual level of domestic pressure in China that you might see being pushed against that. But the human toll is huge. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people uprooted, put into what are essentially prisons. And despite claims that this is all basically working its way through and winding down, the satellite evidence says something else. And it's ongoing. And now we're seeing signs of a light version being pushed in Tibet, where there's been a similar kind of ethno-nationalism that China seems determined to stamp out. But it really is an attempt to wipe out a way of living, the language, the culture, a physical destruction of cemeteries and old cities and things like that. It's massive, and it's proceeding apace.
And without much American pushback at all.
Yeah. It's interesting because the one human right that gets a fair amount of emphasis in the current administration's policy is supposedly religious rights, and that's certainly a big part of this. From the Chinese view, this is a ethno-nationalist separatism thing. The U.S. take on it tends to focus more on religious as well as to some degree ethnic issues, but yeah, very little. Now, to be fair, there's probably not a lot that can be done to change Chinese behavior without escalating to a level that I don't think you're going to see any U.S. administration do.
And that gets to the first question from Carlos Rivers, who had an earlier comment and said, excellent briefing, which I agree with. And Carlos asks, is anybody building a coalition against China?
Well, the Chinese think the U.S. is trying to build a coalition against China. Basically, almost any initiative gets branded as an anti-China, keep China down initiative. So that was the Chinese complaint about the TPP. That was the Chinese complaint about the free and open Indo-Pacific, about the Obama pivot and rebalance. The closest thing to a coalition against China, I think, is really centered on the Quad countries. That is the Australia, Japan, India, U.S. alignment, which has never been robust, but I think has become stronger as concerns about China have grown. There's now an attempt to sort of build a Quad plus on security issues, but it's tough because the next country you'd have to bring in is South Korea, and South Korea-Japan relations aren't exactly so rosy. Yes, that's a fair gesture, John. I think it's you try to raise that issue and you get a one-fingered intervention from some of the people who try to orchestrate these things. So I don't think there's a real anti-China coalition. I don't think the glue is there for it. I think there are things that could be done collectively to put much more pressure on China. And one of the things that I think the US has not done at all well in the last 4 years is to keep the allies and friends together to keep pressure on China. Indeed has set about systematically alienating some of those allies. So there are isolated bright spots. Again, US-Japan relations have been in an extremely good state under Abe. Abe has handled that well. But I think there is a failure to take advantage of the fact that although there are significant differences of interest and preference among the countries you want to bring into this, the Quad plus South Korea plus the Southeast Asian states, they all are worried about Chinese economic and political influence. They all see China as doing things that are harmful to their interests. There's a failure to draw together the common complaints. And I think the way to go about it is to be a little eclectic and a little expansive. So the eclectic part is you're going to have ties with different members of this sphere around China on different issues. Their collaboration isn't going to be uniform. And expansive in the sense of the glue that can hold the broader coalition together can't just be security issues. It's got these economic and ideational issues too. Won't be exactly the same group. But if you draw on those, it helps. It makes it more multifaceted. You can make trade-offs across issue areas, and it defangs it a little bit. If it really looks like a pure security alliance against China, that's just going to escalate these bad dynamics. Whereas you're pushing for market openness and for democratic politics, that's a little more benign, or at least not spearhead pointed so much at China.
That answer, I'm preventing us from talking over each other, but I have to unmute then when I ask the next question. And Nancy Hennigan's question actually flows nicely from that answer. Nancy asks, in the Trump era, we've damaged most international relationships. Do you think we could heal these in a Biden era? I worry about their foreign countries' trust of US policy swings.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question. I think there are actually two big questions. That's one of them. Just as the Abe approach to China was proof of concept of what Japan could do, Trump's been proof of concept that the US is not necessarily always going to be there playing the roles it's played. And how do you can say that's not our policy anymore, but you've proven that it's possible. And China is in Asia by necessity of geography and history. The US is in Asia by choice. And so if doubt about our will, and it's costly for us not to be there, we don't have to be there. And the doubt that's been cast on US commitment, I think is real and serious. So that's one piece of it. That's the piece rightly raised by the question. The other piece is, and I may be wrong about this, but my hunch, my sort of gut feeling on this is that a lot of the world, certainly those countries that are relatively friendly to the US or that are at least inclined to consider partnerships of various sorts with the US to hedge against China problems, have all been kind of holding their breath. And I think there is the consequences of what's gone on the last few years in terms of relations with friends and allies are not fully visible, and that has essentially been holding one's fire until they see if Trump gets reelected. So there's a chance that things will be kind of all is forgiven if Biden comes back, and it's still got the problems that I mentioned in the earlier part of the response. But I think a second Trump term, if he continues on the kind of foreign policy he's had, I think a lot of the hidden damage is going to come to it. It's like when you buy a house and you go and you pull up the carpets, you see the floors are rotted. I think that's kind of the state of our relationship, certainly with allies in Europe, and that may well extend to Asia.
You continue to be cheery. You're consistent, at least, Jacques. I'm going to skip forward to Paul Sparks' first question, picking up on your rotted floor analogy. Paul suggests that China favors Biden because he will be easier to deal with based upon past experiences. Do you agree? Yeah,
so I did a sort of cheeky little piece 4 years ago on red state China, why China wanted Trump. And they clearly, across a wide spectrum of Chinese views, there was a preference for Trump over Hillary, for a whole bunch of different reasons, people with different priorities. I know the Intel report says that the US Intel believes that China wants Biden over Trump. And, that's probably right, but it's much more muddled, and I think it's much more complicated. So I think you can disentangle a couple strands, but I'll try and be brief on this. For the hawks in China who really see conflict with the US as inevitable and see a zero-sum game between the US and China, and who are looking at all long-term, they like Trump because they think he is an accelerant of US decline and declining US influence. For people who want to return to a US-China relationship that is not going to be great, but could be better, and who think that the last few years have been bad for both countries, they clearly want Biden. Then there is a kind of broader, more widely shared view perhaps, or middle view, which says, look, you know, in some ways, Trump is better for Chinese interests because he's so diminished the US's ability to limit China's options, but it's just too much of a headache. The chaos, the tumult, putting out a fire here, putting out a fire there, it's just costly, and we'd rather have somebody we can deal with. Now, there is no illusion in China, nor should there be in the US, that a Biden presidency would be a return to, say, the first years of the Obama presidency, or even the last years of the Obama presidency. That kind of relatively benign, if somewhat troubled, US-China relationship, that ship has sailed or sunk or something. We're not going to get back there. The US domestic politics of relations with China are now dancing on the grave of constructive engagement, and too much has been said and done, and it predates Trump and even predates Xi. It's been building on that trajectory. You know, you're not going to get there, but you can have a more managed relationship. You can have one that has cooperation in areas where we share interests and that takes the ideological tone down.
Can you talk a little bit, Stephen Gett's question, can you talk a little bit to the Chinese share of US national debt and the impact, the influence that gives China, if any?
Yeah, well, there's an old cliche on this, which I'm not above quoting, which is when you owe your banker a little money, you have a problem. When you owe your banker a lot of money, he has a problem. So that I mean, you know, there's always this concern about, will China essentially dump T-bills and create chaos in U.S. financial markets? And China has diversified a little bit away from holding U.S. debt, but not enough. It would be a Pyrrhic victory. I mean, and I think, you know, important as that is, the debt's only a part of the bigger economic relationship. We're going to see real economic consequences that are really bad for the U.S. I think it's going to be disorderly decoupling if that continues to gain momentum. Much more in the real economy than government debt.
Yep, and I can just imagine the uproar if we couldn't get iPhones.
Well, I'm a Samsung Droid person myself, so yeah.
I've heard that about you, Jacques. I've heard that about you.
No need to get
can you elaborate a little more on China's One Belt, One Road policy and its regional effects on China's influence?
You know, I wish I could. The problem with One Belt, One Road is nobody's quite sure what it is. So, you know, it is this slogan. It is Xi Jinping's biggest foreign policy trope. But it's a bunch of things kind of bundled together. So some of it's a label that's put on projects that are going on anyway. Some of it's an attempt to get projects funded because you can bring it under the fancy label. But it is, yeah, and it's grown over time. You know, it started out being just infrastructure, and now there's a digital Silk Road and a health Silk Road and, you know, anything else Silk Road. But if you boil it down to what it basically is that for reasons that are an unclear mix of Chinese domestic economic concerns, how do we deal with overcapacity in certain industries? China's attempt to lay foundations for things that make sense in terms of China's international economic interests, so, you know, sort of building out infrastructure in the linked countries with which China will trade and creating denser economic ties with those countries, including countries that aren't so hooked up with the West generally, but now it extends all the way to Europe. So it's partly that economic agenda. It's partly a political agenda, in the sense that stronger economic ties give China greater political leverage, in the sense of deterring the joining of an anti-China coalition, or in the sense of getting diplomatic support for issues that are important to China but not important to most countries, Taiwan issue or something like that. So there's all that going on. And that does increase China's influence while also in principle serving its economic interests, although the implementation often has been catastrophic economically. And the political blowback is non-trivial as countries worry about debt trap diplomacy, which I don't think is a Chinese agenda, but it's sometimes a consequence. And as there's just sort of resentment about the terms and fear about the use of economic leverage to political ends. It's also not quite as big as it's labeled. You get big dollar price tags on it, but a lot of that is committed, not yet executed. And some of it is putting a label on something that's going to happen anyway. That said, as an economic and political phenomenon, it dwarfs what the US has been up to in the same regions, at least if you're talking the Eurasian landmass, to a degree if you're talking Africa, to a degree if you're talking East Asia, less important in Europe, although there's a little variation. The farther east you get, the more significant it is.
Mm-hmm. Back to the Uyghurs, a good international relations 101 question. Why aren't other Muslim nations supporting the Uyghurs?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. There's a lot of talk about that. Yeah, Turkey made the smallest peep and then quieted down. I think it's that China made it very clear it cared a lot about this. And I suspect it's there's probably a degree of pragmatism. The U.S. and others, and the human rights groups, the UN High Commissioners, they can say whatever they want. But it doesn't seem to have much of an impact on what China does. And so sort of why imperil your relationships with China if it's not really going to have an effect anyway? There's a bit of a glass house problem with some of the more potentially internationally politically potent Muslim states. I mean, you look at Iran, you look at Saudi Arabia, these are not exactly going to be places that stand up for human rights values. In some way, and then if you get to countries that have a better record, like Indonesia and Malaysia and places like that, they've got even more skin in the game with China because China is so important economically to the region. Good
pivot. Moving it to some of those countries closer, and it's a nice transition to Jeffrey Berry's question. What are your views on utilizing Chinese aggression as leverage for U.S. hegemony, big word, within ASEAN, assuming there is U.S. hegemony within ASEAN?
Yeah, I don't think there's U.S. hegemony in ASEAN, but the general point holds, which is that ASEAN, dealing with ASEAN is kind of tricky. I mean, there's very little doubt that most of the ASEAN countries like the notion of ASEAN centrality. They want ASEAN to be the focal point of whatever's going on in the region. They don't want to be marginalized, made a mere appendage of the U.S. or of China. And there is this sort of tension between the US and China over who can kind of get ASEAN more on their side, and they don't want to choose. Countries in the region, the smaller powers in the region, don't want to have to choose between the US and China, and they kind of turn, at least at the margins, against whichever state between the US and China is seen as trying to put them in that position. But sure, the concerns about Chinese assertiveness is helping U.S. relations with especially the maritime states in ASEAN. Vietnam, which has a serious territorial dispute with China, and it's come to blows at times. You see some of that with Malaysia, certainly with Singapore. The Philippines has been sort of a different case. That's a Duterte phenomenon where he's gotten much closer to China. But by and large, maritime and more developed ASEAN has been concerned. Singapore always tries to stay in the middle. Inland ASEAN, poor ASEAN, a little more complicated, much more economically dependent on China in some ways. But even there, you've seen some blowback, like Malaysia under Mahathir has pushed back very hard on some of the BRI undertakings. So long way of saying ASEAN gets pulled in both directions. It likes to remain at the center. It prefers not to choose. Both sides, that is both the US and China, have a sort of fallback strategy of trying to get the chunk of ASEAN they can get to go with them, to stick with them. And so you look at China's responses to the free and open Indo-Pacific, they say, we're going to try and beat this thing back, but if it goes forward, our fallback strategy is to exploit the rift in ASEAN that China has cultivated for reasons initially driven, I think, by South China Sea concerns, but that have now become broader. And the U.S. has a bit of a tension because how do you fit Vietnam into a free and open Indo-Pacific? I mean, it's relatively benign as authoritarian communist regimes go, but it doesn't fit the template terribly well.
Staying with countries torn between the U.S. and China, we've got a question from Celia. on Turkey, Israel, Iran, and the Gulf countries. Do they want to be closer to China or to the United States?
Well, again, I think they'd rather avoid being caught in the middle. One of the great successes of Chinese foreign policy was developing a really pretty good relationship with Israel, and much of that's driven by the high-tech economic interests. Doing that without alienating the Arab states, and China has although this has changed some in China's immediate region for reasons we've been talking about. China's shtick for a long time has been, we don't really care, we're hands off, we're not taking sides in most of the stuff. So some kind of nominal developing country solidarity, but didn't really want to get into the kind of US-Soviet style clash, and basically wanted to say, we're just here to do business, we're not going to talk about your internal order, we don't want to get dragged into the problems in the middle. But as US-China relations deteriorate, and as China becomes more powerful and influential, that's harder to do, because states seek to hedge, states in China's near abroad, seek to hedge some of the China risk by looking again to the US, and that puts them in kind of a difficult position. And as China looks around its periphery, I mean, one of the stories that doesn't get much attention is China's relationship with Iran. They thought that was sort of a secondary concern, and if they got too close to Iran, it blows up US-China relations. But as those start to blow up anyway, we've seen some improvement in some willingness of China to be more open to engaging Iran.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Russia briefly in that answer, and we've got that right, the classic geopolitics question. Where does Russia fit in between the US and China's growing rivalry? From Mary.
Yeah, so the Russia-China alliance is not really, obviously not an alliance. China doesn't have formal allies. And I don't think it's even that close a friendship. I think it's a cohabitation of convenience. There are certain areas in which they're aligned, particularly where the US is sort of pushing back against both of them, the kind of thing we saw in the national security strategy. But I don't think there's any strong alignment of long-term interests, and certainly not of ideology. I mean, they've been through a lot in the communist periods, right? They're post-establishment PRC, they were best friends and then worst enemies, and then a kind of alliance of convenience. And for a while, China was, the balancing against the Soviet Union in the Nixon-Kissinger years and so on. So it's their relationships are going to go back and forth, but it's really a relationship in which they're not permanent friends or allies. Right now, the alignment is China and Russia against the US on a lot of issues. That's partly interest, and it's becoming partly ideational. But I think there is still a significant gap there in that China has a stake in the status quo that Russia doesn't. China still, for all its complaints, benefits from being part of the international economy, part of this system. And it just, it loses if it becomes highly disruptive in a way that Russia doesn't. And I think China also, despite the friction with the US, doesn't see itself, and certainly Xi Jinping doesn't see himself as besieged by the US in a way that Putin does, or as evening scores for what the US did to China, the way Putin wants to even scores for what the US did to the Soviet Union and Russia.
And does that difference in motivation influence the effect to which China versus Russia attempts to interfere in American elections?
I think it does to some degree. I mean, I don't know how to read Putin. I'm not a Russia specialist and all that, but at least, the sort of newspaper readers' sense of this is that with Putin, it's somewhat personal. That's one piece. The other piece I think that is, more evidently true is that Russia benefits from chaos and disruption in a way that China doesn't. Again, China loses something if we get into a real quasi-Cold War thing. It loses a lot of economic gains. And there's no real East Asian equivalent of what Putin wants to do to NATO. There is no East Asian NATO. The Quad is not NATO. The alignment is not there. It's not this anti-Russia, not this anti-China alliance the way Putin certainly perceives NATO and to a degree the EU.
And somebody asked, the Quad is Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. I think we have time for one last question. I'm going to pull you back inside China for that. What is the status of the Chinese Communist Party's cohesion succession? Is it stable, and are there opportunities we can exploit there?
You know, it looks pretty stable. Of course, things look stable until they aren't suddenly. But you know, there are many weaknesses one can point to. The hard authoritarian edge under Xi Jinping is alienating a lot of the people you really want, you know, the sort of intellectuals and so on. It's clearly made the Chinese model pretty unappealing. It's made Chinese strength internationally look more threatening because it's, of course, will plus capacity, and it makes the will look somewhat ill. And there are corruption problems, discipline problems, some of which Xi has gone after. So there are all these things you can point to as cracks, but there are two things to be said. One is you can't beat something with nothing. And the Chinese Communist Party retains an extraordinary monopoly over organized politics within China. Xi Jinping is the most powerful leader we've seen in China since Mao. And that all suggests, you know, certain amount, pretty good prospects for stability. And, you know, China's been through a lot of potentially Soviet Union ending type crises, and none of them has come close. COVID was not Chernobyl, despite some overheated suggestions that it might be. So, you know, it's a pretty good track record there. The biggest risk is the other part of that question. Well, not the biggest risk, but a risk is another part of the question was just asked, which is Xi Jinping, by becoming so powerful, has essentially blown up what had been a not very strongly institutionalized, but incipiently getting a little more institutionalized succession process. And now, you know, if he goes, who's next? That could get ugly because he has essentially refused to designate a successor and is kind of he's the giant among the dwarves at this point, and that has not been the case really since Mao. And we all saw how beautifully the succession worked for Mao. I think he went through 4 or 5 successors by the time he was done, and the one who emerged victorious was somebody he'd essentially exiled from politics.
So I didn't get all the way through the questions, which is just obviously a sign of how engaging Jacques is, how broad your knowledge is, and to me is an indication that we're going to have you back again to talk to this group. So thank you, Jacques, for being so engaging, so open, so generous, and so smart. And now—
And so optimistic. Don't forget optimistic.
I left that one out on purpose, Jacques, I'll be honest with you. However, someone who is optimistic is the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Raleigh Flynn. And ma'am, it is to you, I think, now that we turn, as we successfully did not speak over one another for an entire hour.
And I'm optimistic that we'll have you both back again, because that was such an interesting conversation, and clearly by the number of questions of great interest to our audience. So before we sign off, I just want to talk about some of our coming attractions. We have some really interesting programs coming up next week. On Thursday afternoon at 3, we have Jacques deLisle back again, talking about the legacy of Shinzo Abe's foreign policy, the complex legacy. So that should be very interesting. If you enjoyed Jacques today, I'm sure you'll enjoy him again next week.
I'm just sharing that. Other people are the content.
Oh, there. Okay. But your sharing is always wonderful. On Tuesday, the 13th, 11 a.m., we have a book talk, the new series with Ron Granieri, People, Politics, and Prose. We have our senior fellow, Jeremy Black, who many of you know, who's going to be talking about his new book, which is Military Strategy, A Global History. And then on Friday of that week, the 16th at 11 a.m., we have our newest FPRI Board of Trustees member, General H.R. McMaster, will be talking with our Robert Strauss-Hupé, Chair in Geopolitics, Robert Kaplan. They're going to be talking about General McMaster's new book, Battlegrounds. So please stay tuned, come see us again for that. And again, a shout out, a thank you to our co-chairs today, James Gately, John Piasecki, and Eileen Rosenau, as well as our members, our audience, our board, and our partners, and the Haverford community, and of course, John, our host. Please consider becoming a member if you aren't already. If you're a member, please consider being a higher donor. So thank you again. Take care, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again.